Check, check, check. Yep.
Good morning. Morgan, can you hit number 1 on the switcher so that the right camera shows up? I forgot to hit that. Or try 2. Camera 1, camera 2. There it is. All right. Good morning. I think I already said that, but we're just so glad. Thanks for coming and sticking around for our Magi Talk this morning. We are very excited to have Eric Van den Eckel, did I say it right? Eckel. See, I asked him right before I came up here, and I knew I was going to mess it up. I'm very sorry. We're just so glad to have you here. He is a professor at Ferrum College, and one of the only, I quit Twitter, I don't know, about a year ago, because it was just making me sad all the time. But one of the great blessings is that we met on Twitter, of all places, and I figured out that he was close, and so we've sort of corresponded since then. And then he came out with this great book about the Magi, and it is really great. I think he brought a few copies if anybody's interested in it. It's wonderful. I think you're going to want to read it after you hear his talk. But we're just grateful that he could come and be with us today. So why don't we welcome him, and we'll let him come up here and do his thing.
Remind me what my hard end time is.
Like 10:45, 10:50.
Perfect. Yeah. Well, thank you, Alan, for that. And yeah, thanks for having me. We did, in fact, meet on Twitter. I've been told I'm a lot nicer in person than I am on Twitter. So thank you for humoring that. So I'm here to talk about the Magi. And my pronunciation of Magi is going to shift between Magi and Magi. Because it's pronounced neither of those things in Greek, so we're just going to be patient with that, and it's going to be okay. So anyway, yeah, I teach down the road at Ferrum College. I teach religious studies. My area of research is in early Christianity, early Christian literature, and then early Christianity in the Roman world. So we'll be talking a lot about Rome today, a little bit about Rome, and also some of the things that are underneath Rome. So I've got this sort of cheeky image up here, which is, I found it on just a website called Unsplash, and I thought it was cute. And so I put this for my starting slide. So the Magi are some of the most recognizable characters, right, in the Christmas story. You can't really have a nativity without the Magi, right? You can have a nativity without barnyard animals, but you can't have a nativity without the wise men, right? That's sort of a necessity. They're also really important for early Christians as well. Epiphany used to be a more, not necessarily more important holiday, but certainly a more prominent holiday in early Christianity was Epiphany, the day that the Magi reached Bethlehem. So this is the end of the 12 days of Christmas, right? And so Christmas used to be this sort of a holiday that it kind of inaugurates the season of Epiphany. So they are recognizable, and even if I mean, obviously you're here to hear about the Magi, so when I put this up and I say, who are these people, you recognize them as the Magi. But even if you did not know that you were here for a talk about the Magi, and I put this up here and said, who are these people? Well, this time of year, you can guess, right? These are the wise men. So what I want to do today is, and I teach college students, so this is a little bit of a lecture, but also I kind of want to, keep it lively, so there will be some fun as well. But what I want to do today is to try to defamiliarize this story of the Magi, to take this story and to convince you, not that you've been reading it wrong, but that you have a much more elaborate picture in your mind of what's in this story and what it means. And I want to kind of show how defamiliarizing the story can help us to see it with new eyes, to help us to come to a deeper appreciation of it. And so we're going to start about 1,700 years ago, and we're going to start 1,700 years ago and about 3 floors or so below the streets of Rome, the greatest city in the world, one of my favorite places in the world. And here we're going to start with one of the catacomb networks in Rome. Y'all have probably heard about the catacombs. Oh, and this is also my daughter Jane. She's extremely, extremely excited to be here, and so thanks for welcoming both of us. Did you finish the book yet? About halfway through. So Jane's reading the book right now, which is actually really exciting for me. Underneath Rome, y'all have probably heard of the catacombs of Rome, right? So there's actually about 40 different catacomb networks in Rome. This is one of the more well-known ones. This is called the Priscilla Catacomb, or as they pronounce it in Rome, Priscilla. So the Priscilla Catacomb. And this is, the Priscilla Catacomb is an ancient mine. And Rome is built on a soft volcanic rock. And the Romans really liked this soft volcanic rock because you could cut it into things, build things with it, and also there was material that you could grind up and turn into concrete, or at least one of the ingredients in concrete. And so the Priscilla Catacomb is about 3 levels worth of tunnels, and there's about 40,000 tombs within this one catacomb network. And remember, there's 30 to 40 catacomb networks that we know of in Rome, and this is one with 40,000 tombs and about 5 miles of tunnels. Big, 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 big. Priscilla was a noblewoman, Christian noblewoman, who owned the land above it, and she allowed Christians in the city of Rome to use the caverns as burial grounds. And in this little space here that I've got, this little area here is called the Greek Chapel. It's a tiny, tiny little place where there's all sorts of interesting 4th century frescoes. So from the 300s, the late 300s, early Christians are painting images from the Bible on the walls of this little chapel. And so they have, the boys in the furnace from the book of Daniel. It's one of the ones that is rarely recognizable. I believe Noah and the Ark is in the Greek chapel as well. And you can also see here the Magi. This is the oldest known image of the Magi in the history of Christianity, the earliest known image. And you can see here, that's the detail of it, right? And they're approaching from our left, and then there's Mary sitting with Jesus. Probably there was a star originally. Some of the paint and plaster has kind of chipped off. But you can see here in the larger picture, they're right above the doorway. They're right above the arch. And so right when you walk into the Priscilla Catacomb, right when you walk into the Greek chapel, you see there the Magi. And what do you notice about these figures? I mean, aside from the fact that you kind of can't really tell much detail about them, what stands out to you about them? They're traveling, yes. The colors, right? They're different. They're all different colors, and that's not the screen playing tricks on you. They are all different colors, and so this is kind of, we think, symbolizing the entire world being united, coming to Jesus. This kind of 4th century interpretation. Okay, so let's keep going in the Priscilla Catacomb. Beautiful, beautiful white Italian marble slab. We call it Severa's slab. That is Severa over there to the left. I'll tell you more about her in a second. This is also found in the Priscilla Catacomb. We don't really know where, because it was found during a time where, when people were doing archaeology, it was more like treasure hunting. So they were digging in the ground, and they would find something, and then they would kind of take it away from its spot, right? And so this slab is currently in the Vatican Museum in Rome, but we're not really sure exactly where it came from in the catacomb. But what we do know about it is what function it served. This is called a loculus cover. So if you've seen pictures of the catacombs, you know that in these hallways, there's all these little niches carved into the walls. That's where bodies would go. And if you were poor, then the little niches are called loculi, or loculus. And if you were poor, which most people who were buried in the catacombs were, if you were poor, then your body would be plastered over. There would be like brick or mud or something like this that were plastered over. But if you were wealthy, or if somebody who loved you was wealthy, then you got something like this, commemorating this is where your body is. And so Severa is somebody who is well-to-do. And whoever designed this cover for her loved her very much. So this little Latin inscription here, Severa, may you live in God. Severa was a really young woman. This slab is only about 3 feet long, so she was very, very young when she died. And whoever designed this monument chose the Magi to say something about her. Because that's what we do with funeral monuments, right? What we put on them says something about who we were, who we thought we were, or in this case, who other people thought that she was. Now, what are they trying to say about her? Who knows, right? But it is clearly something good, right? They are using the Magi as positive figures, maybe of generosity, something like that. Now, note here, one of the details that emerges when you see this much more detailed picture, and this is from about the same era as that painting in the Greek chapel. And you notice they've got these funny little hats on, okay? So this is going to emerge in the next 2 slides as well, these funny little hats of the Magi. Another piece of funeral art. This is from a sarcophagus fragment, also in the Vatican Museum. We don't really know exactly how old it is because, again, the person who found it really didn't bother to tell us where they found it. They just found it and brought it back with them. But you see here also these hats of the Magi. These are called Phrygian hats, Phrygian caps, and they're supposed to signify that the Magi are foreigners. Or in the Roman world, the Phrygian cap also could signify that you were a slave or that you had been freed. Okay? Another detail that kind of emerges here from this image are the camels in the background, right? You can't have Magi without camels, even though we'll see in a second there's no camels in Matthew's story. Okay? And then finally, before we get to something a little bit more interesting here, 2 more things real quick. Another image of the Magi, this one from the 6th century, from a church in a city in Italy called Ravenna, or Ravenna sometimes pronounced, up to the north, closer to Venice, on the coast of the Adriatic Sea. And this is a really fascinating picture of the Magi, or a mosaic of the Magi. You see these brightly colored clothing that they're wearing, super ornate. You see those Phrygian caps again, right? This is the sign that they're not from around here. And then a couple of other things, you see that they are named. Okay, so up here at the top, that SCS stands for Saint Balthazar, Saint Melchior, and Saint Gaspar. Did anyone grow up knowing that the Magi have names? You did? Okay. So, I mean, some people do. I was raised United Methodist. I continue to be United Methodist. I had no idea that anyone gave names to the Magi until I was a PhD student. And then all my Catholic friends were like, yeah, they definitely had names. I'm like, but where do they come from? Well, they come from things like this. They're not in Matthew's story, right? But these names, Balthazar, Melchior, and Gaspar, start appearing around the 6th century. Fascinating stuff. The other thing you'll note about this image of the Magi is not only are they dressed in all of these ornate colors, but each of them represents a different stage in life. So you have a young man, an old man, and a middle-aged man. The middle-aged man being the one with the brown facial hair, I guess. But kind of this idea, not only that the entire world of all the different peoples are coming to Jesus, but everyone young and old is coming to Jesus, okay? So all of these images are interpretations of the story that we see in Matthew, right? Interpretations of the story that we see in Matthew. The last image that I'm going to show you is a place that I've never been, actually, which I'm a bit sad about, but one of these days I'll go here. So this is a picture from somebody else, but this is a large wooden sarcophagus, a triple sarcophagus, that is overlaid with gold, called the Shrine of the Three Kings, and it is located in the Cathedral Church of St. Peter in Cologne in Germany. It was supposed to go there in the summer of 2020, and that trip got canceled because we were a world health risk, so didn't get to go here. But what is contained in this box are human remains, bones that are allegedly said to be the bones of the Magi. And are they the bones of the Magi? Well, we're not going to talk about that today, but this box has been said to contain the bones of the Magi since the 1200s when it was built. And the bones of the Magi have allegedly been in Cologne since the 1100s when they were allegedly transferred there from Milan, okay? Now, all of this is to say that when we're dealing with the Magi, we are dealing with a very, very popular tradition. These are some of the most popular characters in the Christian imagination, in the early Christian imagination, and in the modern Christian imagination, right? People are still curious about them. You're here in this room right now I mean, maybe you just found yourself here, right? I don't know. I actually don't know why you're here. Maybe you were lied to. Maybe you were, maybe they said this was something else. But I'm guessing that you're here because you're also interested in the Magi, because there's a lot actually to be interested about when we talk about them. But when we are talking about the Magi, and this is what I try to do in my book and what I'm going to try to walk us through a little bit today, we have to ask this question. When we look at these images, we see this rich interpretive tradition, vivid imagination applied to what is actually a short and not terribly detailed story. And we're going to read Matthew's story in a second because it's super short. And so the first steps of understanding this story of the Magi anew, and kind of rethinking it and kind of asking what could this story have meant, rather than what has it come to mean, which is also an interesting question, but what did the story mean when Matthew wrote it? We have to ask these questions. What do we actually know about the Magi, okay? And also importantly, what do we think we know about the Magi, right? And we're talking about Matthew's gospel. What is actually there? How do we know what we think we know? There is a typo there. I noticed it here. But yes, how do we know what think we know? How do we know what we think we know, of course? What does Matthew tell us? And then, almost as important, what does Matthew not tell us, right? So when I do this in class and I ask students to kind of walk me through the biblical, quote-unquote Christmas story, right? And I say, what is the Christmas story according to the Bible? And you can imagine in your mind, right? Well, there's shepherds, there's wise men, there's a star, camels, maybe some sheep, right? Joseph and Mary are there, right? But then we go to Matthew and we go to Luke, the only two places where the Christmas story is found, and they find that neither of those stories completely captures the image that they have in their head. Because the image that we have in our head is a combination of those two, right? And so when we're looking at Matthew, what is actually there? What is actually there? So I'm going to start here then with Matthew's story, and Matthew's story fits on 3 slides. And as we're going through here, I want you to just pay attention to what is there and then also what's not. And then we'll back up and talk about the role of imagination. Oh, and this is another image from Italy, from the Scrivini Chapel, which was painted early 14th century by Giotto. And one of the really cool things about this, I don't want to try to do a pointer on that because I don't want to I don't want to bring down the system. You'll see up here in the very center in the top, that is the Star of Bethlehem, but you notice that doesn't really look like a star. It looks a lot more like a comet, because when Giotto painted this, it was about 4 or 5 years after Halley's Comet had passed by the Earth. And so Giotto was trying to contemporize it and say, well, I wonder what that star actually was. Maybe it was Halley's Comet. And Halley's Comet actually did pass by the Earth around the time of Jesus' birth, which is kind of a fun little factoid. Was the Star of Bethlehem Halley's Comet? No, for reasons that I'll show you in a second. But we also don't know what it was. All right, ready? Let's read some Matthew. I'll also warn you, this is my own translation of the Greek text because I don't really like the translations, the English translations. Most of it's the same, but there's a couple of words that are a little bit different. All right. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, where is the one who has been born King of the Judeans? For we saw his star at its rising and have come to honor him. King Herod panicked when he heard this, and all of Jerusalem panicked with him. He gathered together all the chief priests and scribes of the people and asked them where the anointed one is to be born. They said to him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for thus it was written by the prophet, and you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the leaders of Judah. For from you will come a ruler who will guide my people Israel. Then Herod summoned the Magi in secret, and he interrogated them regarding the time of the star's appearing. As he sent them to Bethlehem, he said, go and investigate carefully concerning the child. As soon as you find him, report back to me, so that I too may go and honor him. They heard the king, and then set out. Behold, the star that they saw at its rising, went on ahead of them until it came and stopped over where the child was. When they saw the star, they celebrated with a joy that was exceedingly great. They entered the house and saw the child with Mary, his mother, and falling down, they honored him. They opened their chests and offered him gifts, gold, incense, and myrrh. Having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they returned to their own land by another route. And that's it. Now, you keep in mind, right, I had all of those images of this, richness, and you've been thinking about this whole time, stories that you kind of have imagined, what was this like, right? But that's it. Any of you have the James Taylor song in your head, the Home by Another Way, maybe? Maybe not. Maybe not one of his greater hits, but James Taylor definitely wrote a song about the Magi, and I didn't really get to talk about it because apparently writing about James Taylor songs requires a lot of money for copyright. The publisher said, well, you're welcome to do that if you can afford it. And I said, well, I can't. But that's it. Raise your hand if you're a little bit surprised at how short that was. Yeah? Okay. Most people are, and myself included, right? When I first started doing this and kind of went back and started kind of, looking at the story, I was very, very surprised that there wasn't more there, okay? So, a lot less than we remember, a lot less than you remember. When we reread Matthew's story with the attention to detail, one of the things that emerges is just how few details there are, right? One of the things that biblical scholars love to point out, and it's kind of a funny thing that we do, trying to ruin things, right? We try to ruin the Magi for our students and whatever. Really what we're doing is trying to get people to think about it. We're not trying to ruin things. But one of the things that biblical scholars love to point out is that Matthew never says there was 3 Magi. Do you notice that? Matthew never says, behold, 3 Magi came from the east to Jerusalem. Well, why do we say that there's 3? 3 gifts, right? Does it make sense then that there's 3 Magi? I mean, yeah, maybe, right? But think of it this way. If you go to a baby shower, let's say all of you are invited to a baby shower, everyone brings the same gifts to a baby shower: diapers, wipes, shoes, which are a really funny thing for a baby, right? My mother, when Jane was born, I'll embarrass her for a second. When Jane was born, we got all these shoes for my mother. I was like, what's she going to do with these? She just lays in her bed. She's not walking around on shoes, whatever. But I guess baby shoes are also cute. But anyway, you bring diapers, wipes, and toys, right? So all of you are going to bring one of these gifts. So you're bringing 3 gifts, but there's quite a few of you here, right? So Matthew never says 3. Does Matthew imagine in his head 3? Yeah, probably, right? But he never actually says 3. He says 3 gifts. As I already mentioned, they're not riding any camels. There's really no detail about how they're traveling, right? There's no details about who they're traveling with. We don't know where they're from. They're from the east. So am I, though. I came here from Roanoke. Right? So, if somebody says, where are you from? And you say, I'm from the east. Thanks, right? That's really, really helpful. Well, they're from the east. So what is the east for Matthew? If Matthew is writing in a kind of Roman imperial context, and you think about Italy and the Mediterranean world, well, what's the east? I mean, everything from Persia, Parthia, all the way to China, right? Is China the east? I mean, yes, right, technically. So where are they from? Well, we don't know. And then the really, really fascinating thing is that the Magi only say one thing in Matthew. They only have one line. Now, there's certainly stuff that's happening behind the scenes, but there's only one line of dialogue. Where is the one who has been born King of the Judeans? For we saw his star at its rising and have come to honor him. Now, 2 things real quick before we move on to the next slide. The couple of things that you've probably noticed is that, number 1, I am translating, I'm talking about here in my story, the King of the Judeans, whereas what you are more familiar with is the King of the Jews. Yes? Okay. So the word, and we'll get to this in a bit, but really the word in Greek is Judaioi, and it is a word that can either mean Jew or Jews or Judeans, and I'm translating it as Judeans for a reason that'll become pretty clear. And also, you'll notice that I'm referring to these people as Magi. I probably should have started by saying we're not calling them wise men, we're calling them Magi, again, for reasons that are going to become clear in a second, okay? So with this lack of detail then, and I apologize in advance for the caption on this slide, they put the Magi in imagination. You can't spell imagination without Magi. I'm so sorry. This is how you get yourself uninvited. Can I come back and talk about Christmas again? No, thanks, we're good. Remember how you embarrassed yourself last year? So anyway, and if this is appealing to you, if you like these sorts of jokes, the book is full of them. So I make no real apologies for that. But anyway, a fun little picture here from a Psalter, the Queen Mary Psalter with all the Magi cuddled up together, receiving the warning from the angel to not return back to Jerusalem. But with this lack of detail, when we look at stories that don't really have a lot of details, when we look at these stories and we think about these stories, what happens is that our brains fill in the details. Okay, so when we have stories, and biblical scholars, when we're talking about concepts, we always prefer fancy words to non-fancy words, and so we call these stories indeterminate. They are indeterminate stories, meaning they are open-ended, and there's all sorts of little details that need to be filled in. If you're familiar with the concept of fan fiction, there's plenty of biblical scholars who are kind of using this idea of fan fiction in order to explain how early Christians are filling in the gaps, right? Fan fiction being like if you've got, let's say, a character in Star Wars, and somebody says, I want to explore what this character's life might have been like, and so they write an entire backstory. The same kind of thing is happening with the Magi, okay? But the same thing also happens in other places as well. For example, the story of Jesus' birth in the Gospel of Luke, right? And you imagine the nativity in your mind, and the place that most people imagine the nativity is taking place is a stable, right? And this comes from Luke. But Luke doesn't actually say that Jesus was born in a stable. Luke says that Jesus was put to sleep in a manger, which is a feeding trough. Where would you find a feeding trough? Well, probably a stable, right? But that detail's not there. Your brain's filled it in for you, right? Yeah. So, when we look at these questions that Matthew really doesn't answer, okay? Who, what were the Magi? We'll get to that in a second. How many? How many were there? There is a text that I discuss in this book, and then we'll talk a bit about in a second, called the Revelation of the Magi. In the Revelation of the Magi, there's 12 Magi who come to Bethlehem. Fascinating. In Rome, there's a catacomb called the Catacomb of Domitilla, where there are 4 Magi. And then there's another catacomb in Rome called the Catacomb of Peter and Marcellinus, where there's 2 Magi. Really interesting, right? So, are these accurate for Matthew's story? Sure, because Matthew never says 3. He just says 3 gifts, right? Who and what are they? Who and what are they? Are they priests? Are they Gentiles? This has been a very, very popular interpretation throughout the years, is that they're non-Jews. Are they Jews from Babylon? Babylon's in the east, and there are Magi in Babylon, so are they Jews from Babylon? Or are they kings? There's plenty of traditions that establish them as kings. Y'all have heard the story, or the song, We Three Kings, right? We three kings, are they kings? Who and what are they? Matthew doesn't say, so our imaginations take over. Where are they from? The east, right? Or are they from Persia? In the Revelation of the Magi, they're from a mythical land called Shir, S-H-I-R, which if you've never heard of, that's because it doesn't exist, okay? What's the star? This is a really, really fascinating one, right? What is the star? Is it a comet? Is it Halley's Comet? Is it a supernova? Is it an angel? Or is it Jesus himself? There's some traditions say that the star was actually Jesus. Why these gifts? Y'all have heard the jokes, right? These are horrible gifts for a baby. You know, Mary's like, maybe, I mean, the gold is fine, right? We can do something with this, right? But like, who gives a baby incense? Who gives a baby myrrh, right? And myrrh, and my beloved daughter just mentioned myrrh as a use in burial ointments, right? But myrrh is not a burial ointment in the ancient world. It's a spice. And it's also a medicine. So there's a Greek physician named Hippocrates. You might have heard of him. The Hippocratic Oath is named after him. And Hippocrates said that myrrh is actually great for ulcers. Hippocrates wrote an entire book on ulcers. It's riveting. That's a lie. It's actually really, really boring. But it's interesting because he says, hey, if you want to solve your ulcer problem, try myrrh. Put it in a little bit of wine or whatever, because everyone knows if you have an ulcer, the right thing to do is to drink wine, like with random stuff in it. It makes sense, right? 2 Timothy, actually, Paul, the author of 2 Timothy says, drink a little bit of wine for your stomach problems. I mean, it's no wonder they didn't feel very good. So why these gifts? Why gold? Why incense? Why myrrh? Is there some sort of special symbolic meaning? Well, Matthew doesn't seem to think so, but early Christians do. Early Christians say the gold is signifying Jesus' royal status. The incense is signifying his divine status. Incense is something that's used in temples for offerings and those sorts of things. And then myrrh, as Jane reminded us, is often symbolizing his humanity and his death. Why in the world is Herod panicked? That's another question, right? Herod panics. The Magi show up and they say, where's the one born king of the Judeans? Well, Herod's title is king of the Judeans. So why is he, oh my gosh, and the whole city is panicked with him. Why? Well, there's a really fascinating story called the Armenian Gospel of the Infancy that I don't think most of you have probably read because it's not terribly well known. In the Armenian Gospel of the Infancy, the Magi show up. There's 3, but they show up with armies. They show up with 12,000 troops. A story that you've probably not heard, right? The Magi show up, and then when they reach Jerusalem, the star fades from view, and they say, well, we're going to camp out here overnight. And so the army of 12,000 people camps out around the city of Jerusalem, and Herod looks out and he goes, oh no, because the city is under siege, right? A very, very different story. But why does he panic? Why is he really concerned? And then ultimately, what's the point of this story, okay? So, now that have I sufficiently defamiliarized you of this story at this point? Raise your hand if you're not really sure what to believe anymore. Good. Okay. Good. That's good. There's a book that can help you, but we'll touch on it here. Okay. All right. So what's in a name? Let's talk about why I have been calling these folks Magi, and not wise men, not astrologers, not kings, not sorcerers, not any of these things. The Greek word that Matthew uses here is the word magos, and magos, and he uses the plural magoi or magoi, and the word magos is actually an adjective. It's not a noun; it's an adjective. So it describes a type of person. Okay, so just like and we use adjectives all the time as formal nouns in English, right? The good, the bad, and the ugly. Those are all adjectives, but we use those as the good, the bad, the ugly people or things or whatever. But when Matthew says the magoi come to Jerusalem, he is using a word that is describing some kind of characteristic of who these people are. Now, the problem is he doesn't tell us really what he means when he uses this word. And this word is loaded in the ancient world, absolutely loaded, okay? So when Matthew is using it, he is using it, he's using it knowing this, right? Let me give you an example. Let's say I'm going to tell you a story that happened yesterday. And the story, and I'm going to give you 2 different starts to this story. Start number 1. I looked out my window this morning, and out on the street corner, there was a man standing there. He looked at my house, and he began to walk towards it. All right, that's the start of my first story. The first start of my story. The second start of my story. I looked out the window this morning, and there was a lawyer standing on the street corner. He looked at my house, and he began to walk towards it. Now, those are 2 very different stories, right? A man walks to my house. What does he want, right? Maybe he's a postal carrier. maybe he's a lawyer, but I didn't actually say that. But when I start that story, a lawyer was standing outside my house, and he began to walk to the door. Well, should I be panicked? Maybe he's there. Maybe he's there to tell me that I have a rich uncle that I never knew about and that I have just inherited a lot of money. Or maybe he's there to let me know that I no longer own my house. Right? The bank's going to be living here now, right? Lawyer is a loaded term. My dad's a lawyer, so I'm not hating on lawyers. But lawyer is a loaded term, and depending on what your relationship is with the lawyer, it can either be very positive or very negative. The same thing is true for Magi, okay? Sometimes it's used as an insult. In the New Testament, there's only 2 other people who are described as being a Magi, and they're both in the book of Acts. In Acts, there's a character named Simon, who in later tradition becomes known as Simon the Magus. But Simon is a sort of street performer. He's a magician. He practices magic. And when he sees the apostles laying on hands and giving people the Holy Spirit, he comes up to Peter and he goes, "How much? How much would it cost for me to be able to do that?" He tries to buy this power. And Peter, of course, curses him, sends him away, right? And he's really, really upset about this. But this is an insult. Simon is greedy, and he's a charlatan. The other character is really, really fascinating. He's on the island of Cyprus, and his name is Bar-Jesus, but he also goes by the name of Elymas. We're not really sure. The names aren't really related. And he's called a magus, and he's also called a Jewish false prophet. And Elymas, Paul is on the island of Cyprus, and Paul is trying to talk to a government official. And Elymas is saying, "I don't want this government official to hear about Jesus. I don't want him to hear about the gospel." And Paul yells at Elymas and strikes him blind and sends him away. He sort of has to grope his way out of the story, right? So these are the only 2 other Magi in the New Testament. You have Matthews, who are coming to Jesus, coming to Bethlehem, and then you have these horrible charlatan figures, right? A loaded term. In other texts outside the New Testament, other ancient literature, this term can also refer to respected priestly figures. Sometimes it refers to priests in a religion called Zoroastrianism. Sometimes it refers to advisory figures who can interpret visions and understand dreams. It also it refers to people who are located in the courts of kings. And when the Magi show up, it's either good news for the king, meaning, we're gonna help you stay in power, or it can also be really bad news, which it is in Matthew for Herod, right? This is bad news. The new king's in town, okay? So this is why I've chosen to refer to them as just Magi and not any of these other things, okay? What's the star, right? There's a lot of ink that's been spilled on what's the star, right? A couple years ago, there was a planetary conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn, okay? And this was, you might remember it, it was a big, big deal. We drove around, because it was a cloudy night one night, so we couldn't see it, but we drove around to it was really, really nice and bright. And it occurred right around this time of year, and so everyone was saying, "Oh my gosh, is this the Star of Bethlehem?" There was an astronomer named Johannes Kepler who believed that this same conjunction was the Star of Bethlehem. But what was the star actually? Well, we don't know. We don't know if Matthew is even thinking about a specific astronomical event. If you think back to all of the astronomical events that you've seen in your life, meteor showers, eclipses, comets. I remember in the mid-90s when the Hale-Bopp comet, I had just gotten my driver's license, and so I remember driving out to a field so I could look up and see. You'll remember maybe this, if you were alive in the mid-90s. The comet, you could see it with the naked eye. It was really, really beautiful, right? But what is Matthew actually thinking about? Or is he even thinking about a specific star at all? One of the things to keep in mind is that for Matthew and his readers, there's a whole way of speaking about rulers and linking those rulers to stars. So there's a couple of examples of this in the Old Testament. In the book of Numbers, there's a prophet named Balaam who, or sometimes you hear this pronounced Balaam, and he's perhaps more well known for the talking donkey who appears in his story. If you've heard of this story before, he's agitated with the donkey, and so he starts hitting it, and then all of a sudden it starts speaking, and he goes, "Why are you doing this? Like, why are you? I'm generally a good donkey. Like, why are you treating me this way?" But Balaam also it gives a prophecy where he talks about a star coming out of Jacob. And a lot of people in the past have said that this is probably what Matthew is referencing, the star coming out of Jacob, because Jesus being the star or whatever. But then again, also when Matthew cites things from the Old Testament, he also tends to let his readers know, I just did this thing, right? And so he doesn't do that here, but who knows? There's another very well-known linking of leaders and stars in Isaiah 14, when the prophet speaks against the king of Babylon. How you are fallen from heaven, O day star, son of dawn, or son of the morning. A very, very well-known passage that, at least since Milton, has been popularized as being about the fall of Satan. But in its original context in Isaiah, God says, take up this taunt against the king of Babylon. So this is, your star is fallen. You are no longer king, or you're no longer the rightful king. And then in later traditions, as I mentioned, the star is Jesus himself. Now, I told you we were going to talk about Rome, so let's talk about Rome. The Romans also had stars, and the Romans also interpreted stars as being linked to specific leaders. There's a very, very, very well-known star that comes to light. Sorry for that one. A very, very well-known star that comes to light after the assassination of Julius Caesar. So y'all have heard about this, at least from Shakespeare, right? Beware the Ides of March. So Caesar is assassinated in mid-March by the Roman Senate in 44 BC. And a few months later, during the summer, there is a comet that appears in the sky. This comet is mentioned in both Roman and Chinese sources. Astronomers have tried to figure out exactly what this event was, but the fact that two different pools of authors talk about it means that probably, the Chinese are not communicating with the Romans, but they're both writing about an astronomical event that happens in that summer of 44. There's two authors named Suetonius and Pliny the Elder, and they say that the comet was visible for about a week, and they say that it was so bright you could see it in the afternoon. So, a very, very significant comet. Not surprisingly then, many of the Romans, so Julius Caesar, the Senate didn't like him because he got too powerful, but the people of Rome loved him because he did a lot of good for the city of Rome, for the empire, for the later empire. Some in the city, a lot of people in the city, the common folk, according to the Roman authors, interpreted this comet, the arrival of this comet, as a sign that Caesar's soul had become deified, that he had ascended to the pantheon and that he was now a god. And so he now deserved to be worshipped. The Senate agreed, and they voted, and they said, yes, Caesar is absolutely a god. Now, here's a denarius. And this is a denarius that would have been in use in the first century. And you see on the head up there, this is not Julius Caesar. That is Julius Caesar's adopted son, Octavian, who takes the name Caesar Augustus. Now, think for a second. If you're making a list of people who might be interested in Julius Caesar being a god, foremost among those is probably going to be Octavian. Why? If Caesar is a god, what does that make him? A son of God. Ooh, okay. So, Caesar Augustus, and then on the back there, Divus Iulius, the divine Julius. And right in the middle, there's the comet. There's the star, okay? So, here's an example of where Rome is also using a star as a claim of divinity and also a claim of legitimacy. Caesar Augustus is the first Roman emperor. Julius Caesar is a dictator. He's not an emperor. But his adopted son becomes the first Roman emperor. And if you are trying to transition your system of government from a republic, which is what Rome was for a while, to an empire, one of the ways to do this is to make it seem like the gods are in charge of it and that this is something that God wants. And so Octavian, Caesar Augustus, uses this imagery. Look, my dad is a god, and I'm his son. The star said as much. Something is going on like this in Matthew, right? The star is pointing to the true ruler. So, if we try to bring some of this together, take us to your leader. This is what the Magi are asking. This is a mosaic from a beautiful church in another beautiful church in Rome, the Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore. Beautiful, beautiful place. When they show up, and the little tiny short thing that they say, all of this kind of comes together in what they say to Herod and the people in Jerusalem. Where is the one who has been born king of the Judeans? That's important, the one who has been born king of the Judeans. Because Herod, his title, his formal title, is the king of the Judeans. But where did he get that from? Well, there's a first century historian named Josephus who tells us he got that because the Roman Senate gave it to him. The Roman Senate says, you are the king of the Judeans. We have voted. You're the king of the Judeans. And this is a little bit of a problem for some Judeans because Herod isn't ethnically a Judean. Herod is an Idumean. And so Herod is a false king. And people in the first century are thinking about him as a false king. He's a puppet king of the Romans. And so when the Magi show up and say, where is the one who has been born king of the Judeans? And Herod says, well, I'm going to get my advisors and see where this one's supposed to be born. That's Herod in Matthew's story saying, well, it ain't me. It ain't me, right? So where's the one born king of the Judeans? And of course, the reader of Matthew says, well, that's Jesus. Jesus is the king of the Judeans, the real one. We saw his star at its rising and have come to honor him. When one star rises, another star always falls. And so when Herod panics, I mean, first of all, when Magi show up in the ancient world and you're a king, you have reason to be concerned. So this kind of explains this. But when they come and they start talking about, we saw the star rise, what that means is your star is heading down, right? So this is a really, really, and we've kind of just scratched the surface here. I hope it's been interesting, and I realize I'm running up on my time. But when you reread this story and you try to kind of look at it in that kind of first century context of what imagery is Matthew playing with here, it's still a really, really interesting story, and it kind of gives you a new appreciation for what Matthew is doing. And also Matthew is, with this title, the King of the Judeans, which is very clearly for Matthew, Jesus, right? Jesus is the King of the Judeans. In the Gospel of Matthew, that title only appears one other time. It appears at the crucifixion when the Roman governor Pilate puts it over Jesus' head. This is the King of the Judeans. And so Matthew is also playing with the notion of power, right? This is what happens to the King of the Judeans, but this is what leadership looks like. And this is also what happens when, this is what Rome does to the King of the Judeans, right? And it also says something about Herod, right? The Romans didn't kill Herod because he behaved and did whatever they wanted to. And Jesus didn't. He sort of resists, yeah. So anyway, I hope this has been helpful, interesting. I'm going to call Alan up to take the giant shepherd's crook and drag me off the stage. But thank you so much for coming, laughing at my jokes, and yeah, thank you. All right, there you go.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here. I was super interesting, and it's fun after having read the book. It's fun to hear you talk about it because you're as enthusiastic about it in person as you are in the book. I really do recommend the book. The book, he's right. He only scratched the surface. It's super fascinating and only goes deeper, and you just learn a ton. It's very easy to read. So, we are so glad you're here. Thank you all for coming as well. And if you have, I'm sure he'll be around for a few minutes if you have questions afterwards. For folks who are watching online, thanks for doing that. Let's thank her one more time for being with us. All right, and if you're here and you're staying for church, we're looking forward to having the Roanoke Brass today at the late service, so we're excited about that as well. So hope we'll see you over there.